This is an infamous cold case. It has gone unanswered for 60 years. What is it about this case that still stands out in so many people's minds?
Well, I think we're so used to hearing about unusual murders in this media age, but back in the 1950s, this was highly unusual because it was a stranger murder.
Hi, my name is Madison, and you are listening to or watching Who's Knocking, a true crime podcast. Hello, welcome back. We're here with a new episode. This is an unsolved double murder story. I love, God, it's always so hard. I really enjoy telling unsolved cases. I think they're fascinating. I love theories. I love trying to figure it out in my own head. You know, I am a detective. I do have a detective history. Some of you know what it is. Go find it if you want. Please don't. So I decided this week I wanted to do an unsolved crime. And this, I was researching different unsolved murders, and I had never heard of this one before. It is somewhat popular. I found quite a bit on it. Definitely one of the more famous, older, unsolved murders of Chicago's history. And it was definitely a huge case at the time. Okay, before I start, I just want to say, if you have been enjoying my videos, if you like this video, if you haven't seen any others, take a look at some others. Please consider subscribing. That would be pretty awesome if you did. Or if you liked or comment or shared, what have you, you know. Also, I do have a true crime newsletter that comes out every Friday. You can sign up for it for free at grimweekly.com. I'm working on the website right now. It needs a couple little tweaks, but it does have an archive feature. So if you want to go in and take a look at all the previous newsletters, you can do so before the giant commitment of signing up for free. So with all that out of the way, let's get into the video. This story takes place in Chicago, Illinois in 1956. It was just after Christmas. It was, you know, that in-between time between Christmas and New Year's where there's no school, there's nothing much to do, so you just kind of chill with your family and like soak in the rest of the holidays. That's what you do now. That's what you've done since I've been born, but it was the 50s. I assume that it was similar and that they had Christmas break, but I don't know. I wasn't there. But it was December 28th, and sisters Barbara and Patricia Grimes headed to the Brighton Theater in Chicago, which was only about a mile away from their home. Now, the pair had about $2.50 between them, and they were going to see Love Me Tender, starring Elvis Presley, the Elvis Presley, and both girls were head over heels, giant fans of Elvis Presley, pictures of him in their rooms. They loved the guy, as many did at the time, as many still do. They had already seen the movie at a minimum of 10 times. There's conflicting, some people say they saw the movie 10 times, some people say like 15 times, but I'd say the lowest estimate is they'd seen the movie already 10 times. Now, their mother was not super into the idea of letting them go. They had gone out the night before and they were late coming home, so she had decided that they were not going to go out tonight. But Loretta Grimes was a divorced single mother of 6 children, and so it's, you know, not unreasonable that she relented. I'm sure that the girls begged and pleaded with the vigor that only teenage girls have when they want something. And so she decided to let them go. The family, I don't know who was home at the time, but I'm sure other siblings were home at the time. They had dinner together. And then at around 10:30, the girls left, promising to be home by midnight. They took the bus to the theater, which is a trip that they had taken many times before. And off they went. And unfortunately, they would never make it home. So at the theater, the girls had a great time by all accounts. They watched their boy Elvis on the screen do his thing again. And a friend of theirs named Dorothy Weinard, who was a classmate of theirs, said that she saw them there and she attended the same show. She mentioned that when they were leaving, the girls were still at the theater and they were in line at the concession stand and nothing was out of the ordinary. Now, Dorothy said that she left after seeing the girls at around 10:15 p.m. and she assumed that they were staying for the next show as they were at the concession stand, seemingly buying more popcorn or what have you. When the girls did not return home, initially, their mother, Loretta, thought that maybe they'd stayed for the second showing of the movie, which wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility. Again, they'd seen this movie at least 10 times. Clearly, they just really liked this movie. But as time crept on, their mother got more and more worried as it neared midnight. She sent two of the older siblings, Joey and Teresa, to wait by the bus stop that the girls should have arrived at. But after 3 buses came and went and there was no sign of Barbara or Patricia, they knew that something was very wrong. Now, according to the sister, Teresa, there just happened to be a police officer sitting nearby in a car. So they approached him, they told him what was going on, and he told them to go home and be with their mother, and he was going to drive to the theater and back to see if he could find anything in that route. The officer found nothing of value, and there was no signs of the girls. So by about 2 a.m., both Barbara and Patricia were officially declared missing persons. A little bit about Barbara and Patricia. Barbara was 15 years old, and Patricia was 13, almost 13. They were both beautiful girls who were very close to each other. They were they had a kind of best friend type relationship with each other. Now, Patricia was very tall for her age, but her older sister said that she was very graceful and very beautiful. A lot of these kids, especially when they're in grade 7, which she was, and they get super tall, they're like string beans and they're kind of awkward, but Patricia was not. She was tall and she rocked it, apparently. She was described as very high-spirited and fun. She was outgoing. She was in the 7th grade and she was due to turn 13 on December 30th, which was only in 2 days, That sounded weird. Even though Patricia was younger than Barbara, she was more of the leader. She was more the one who called the shots in their relationship. Barbara was also very beautiful. She was quite petite and she had a dazzling smile, according to her family. She was much more serious and more reserved than Patricia, but perhaps that just came with being older. I don't know. Now, the Grimes family, according to Teresa, they grew up quite poor. There were 6 kids in total, 2 boys and 4 girls. There was Joey, James, Shirley, Teresa, Barbara, and Patricia. And they had had another sister named Leona, but tragically she died unexpectedly at the age of 26. Now, Loretta had been married to Joseph Grimes, who was the father of all of her children, but they were divorced in 1951, and he went on to get remarried. As you can see, Barbara and Patricia did not have the easiest life before they went missing, but they did have a mother who cared for them greatly and a bunch of siblings who seemed to, at least for the most part, get along very well, and they were a family that cared for each other. They were not a family, these kids were not troublemakers. They weren't getting off into trouble or causing issues. Loretta worked 7 days a week to care for her children, and it could not have been easy. But the kids were good kids. They knew that their mother worked hard for them, and they respected her, and they helped her by doing chores and not being shitty to her. I think it was Barbara who had some sort of job. I don't remember what job she had, but she would give most, if not all, of her paycheck to her mother, which was clearly a huge sign of respect and a sign of that you... which is, kind of shocking in a 15-year-old that you really care for your mother and respect and identify that the struggles that she's going through, which to me, teenagers are not known for that sort of, wisdom, I'll say. At first, after the girls went missing, the police were pretty convinced that they were runaways, that they were misbehaving teen girls who were looking for a good time. Loretta was not having this narrative. She kept insisting that this was not the case, that her girls would never do something like that, especially since she had birthday plans with Patricia coming up. I think they were supposed to go have lunch downtown, and Loretta was going to buy Patricia a new blouse. And again, she was due to turn 13. Not to mention, both girls had received I don't know if both of them had received their own each or if there was one between them, but they had received little radios, which was something that they really, really wanted for Christmas, and they got them for Christmas, and they left them behind. And she said they would never run away and leave these radios behind. It feels like it would be the equivalent of like two sisters disappear and they left their iPhones behind. Like, it doesn't make sense. Once it was determined that the girls did not just run away, and the police kind of agreed with that idea, a huge, exhaustive search began. But honestly, it kind of seemed a little bit too late. Kind of feels like you should always just assume that they're not runaways until you get evidence that they are runaways, just in case they're not, like in this case and many. But anyway, that's what they did. Now, hundreds of officers from the Chicago and Cook County area were involved, as well as guys from many of the neighboring towns. There were 300,000 people who would be spoken to in total in the length of this investigation. And 2,000 of those people were investigated further. And that's a lot. It cannot be overstated just how large this search and investigation was. At the time, stranger abductions were very uncommon. They still are, but I think now we kind of have this illusion that they're much more common thanks to the 24-hour news cycle, but that's a whole other thing. But anyway, residents of Chicago had always felt safe. Often were not locking their doors. They were trusting their children to mill about unsupervised. And this situation really kind of threw all of that into question. Or it was one of the few situations that did affect people in that way. Like a lot of high-profile missing persons cases, the notoriety of it did end up hindering things in a way. You know, it's kind of a double-edged sword. You want to really have, if your kids go missing, you want it everywhere. You want everyone to know about it because anybody could be a helpful person. But that made it so that there were thousands and thousands of tips. So many people claimed that they had seen the girls, not only in the Chicago area, but all over the country as far as Tennessee. And investigating all of these claims just really sucked the life out of everything. And that's how they ended up getting to that 300,000 number of all the people that they had spoken to. And it's interesting because it seems to happen so often that when you open up a tip line, you always end up with a huge majority of these tips being completely useless. And it's not just that they're useless. They also suck the life out of all the resources that you do have to begin with. Nowadays, sometimes you see police being hesitant to put out a tip line or ask for any help from the public. And this is largely why, especially if the particular force that you're dealing with has less resources, because then you're ending up spending the majority of your resources looking into what are inevitably found to be fake tips or just people who want attention, which those people are the literal scum of the earth. If that's you, fuck you. But as I said, this investigation was huge. The FBI even got involved at one point because Loretta was sent a number of different ransom notes, all of which pretty much ended up to be nothing, but at least it did get the help of the FBI, so that's a good thing. Now, Loretta ended up receiving a lot of ransom letters, as I said, and phone calls from a host of messed up people who, thought it was funny or entertaining to harass a mother of two missing girls. One seemingly very credible phone call came from a man who said that they would find the girls dead behind the Brighton Theater. They were not ultimately found there, but the call seemed very real because the caller mentioned something about Patricia, which had not been released to the public. And that was the fact that she had crossed toes, which I don't think that her feet were, her toes were always crossed, but she had a habit of crossing her toes. This felt very credible, especially to Loretta, because there was no way that somebody would know this unless they knew the girls intimately. But again, it was another super creepy call among many, so there wasn't much that came of that at the time. Now, the media also ran with this story, and they ran far. So far, actually, that Elvis himself got a hold of it and ended up making a public statement pleading with the girls to come home. Now, I'm not sure if people these days understand what a big deal Elvis was back in that era. He was quite popular. I'd say it's probably like the level of Harry Styles right now. I don't know a whole lot about Harry Styles, but he seems pretty popular. I don't know. And it's actually really upsetting to think about because If those girls ever saw that, or if they knew that Elvis Presley knew who they were and like gave a shit about their predicament, like they would have been over the moon. They would have, like, can you imagine? But unfortunately, they would never know. Now, it was 25 days after the girls had gone missing when a motorist named Leonard Prescott was passing through the southwest suburb of Chicago called Willow Springs when he saw something that caught his eye just past a guardrail off the road in Devil's Creek. And I think the road was called like West German Road or something. German Church Road, I think. Now, like most people, when they come across dead bodies, this man initially thought that he was seeing some discarded mannequins. Now, this man was very hesitant to approach what he thought were mannequins, as I'm sure deep down he knew either what they were or could potentially be. So he stopped for a moment and he went home. He got his wife, and then the two of them went back to the location together and they took a closer look. And immediately upon seeing the bodies, his wife like fainted because it was in fact the two dead and naked bodies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes, who everyone was looking for. Now, there was a huge scene as the media found out very quickly. The girls' father, Joseph, had to come down and identify their bodies, which fucking sucked, I'm sure. One of the investigators on the scene noted that there was snow underneath the girls, so it was likely that they'd been there at least 3 to 5 days. What was very odd about their bodies is that they were stacked on top of each other, with Patricia on top of Barbara. They were not in any sort of natural position. It did not look like they had like wandered out and frozen to death by accident. Barbara was laying on her left side with her legs slightly up towards her torso, and Patricia was on top of her on her back with her body covering her sister's head and her own head turned sharply to the right. Now, unfortunately, the crime scene was completely trampled over by everyone and anyone, so any potential evidence was most likely destroyed. Again, this is long before crime scenes were cordoned off and hazmat suits were worn, well before this. So that all went down, and then the girls had their autopsies, and they revealed a lot, but weren't so helpful, and also kind of created a bunch of confusion, if you will. So here I will attempt to parse out what was found in the autopsies. The autopsies were performed mainly by 2 experts, and there was also this man who I will get to, who was an assistant to the coroners, who was like very involved and was like there through every step of the way. Now, the official cause of death was homicide for both, and the manner of death was listed as secondary shock from low temperatures. Now, Patricia's chest had a bunch of minor puncture wounds from what looked to be some sort of weapon that was maybe like an ice pick type, like a little pokes. And Barbara had marks and bruises all over her face. Most of the damage to their bodies was later determined to have been done by animals and or rodents. And after examining both girls' stomach contents, the conclusion was reached that the girls must have died the same night that they went missing, as they still had the last dinner that they shared with their mother partially digested in their stomachs. Now, there were also signs that Barbara had been involved in some sort of sexual activity. They found semen inside of her. Now, they said at the time that they were not able to determine whether or not whatever sexual activity had been consensual or not. I'm no expert, of course, but the fact that she was murdered to me indicates a very high probability that it was non-consensual. I feel like that's not a huge leap, but I don't know. Now, there was semen found in Barbara, and it was collected in hopes that it would later be able to be compared to a suspect. Great. Fabulous. I don't know if they had the ability at that time, but they collected it. Great. We'll see. Now, there is quite a bit of speculation about these autopsies because, as I said, the official autopsy states that they died of exposure. It said, quote, body temperature below the critical level compatible with life. It does appear that the girls had been kind of tossed over the pass that they were found beside. And if it was exposure that they died of, one would have to assume that they were in some way incapacitated before they were left there. If because you have to assume that they were alive when they were left there and then ended up dying. But their autopsies also mentioned that there were no signs of drugs or alcohol in their systems. Although I don't know how rigorous a test like that can be, because, sometimes people, when they do autopsies, they like look for specific drugs, but like you have to do even more specific tests to look for further intoxication or further signs of specific drugs. And sometimes signs of drugs can dissipate after a while. And then in some instances, there are a lot of drugs that can leave your system and that are undetectable after a certain amount of time. And they were left there for 25, I think it was 25 days, I said. So I feel like it's definitely possible that they did have some sort of like drug in their systems, but it was not able to be detected. Let me know if I'm wrong about that in any way, because maybe it's the case that if you're dead, it will always be able to be found within your system, or they were clearly frozen for a little while, so maybe that would help keep it in their systems, but I'm not sure. What does seem to be true is that there was a lot of disagreement and debate over cause and time of death, depending on who you talk to. And some people believe that even the debate is kind of suspicious. Chief investigator Harry Gloss, who was the third expert, although not a medical examiner himself, he was the chief investigator to the coroner. So there was a 5-hour look over of the bodies before they even got to the autopsies, and he was there. He was present for all of this. So he had extensive knowledge of the autopsies, but again, not a doctor. He believed that the thin layer of ice found encrusted over both girls was proof that they had died closer to January 7th, as opposed to very on the 28th or very close to the 28th of December that everyone else thought. Now, this is because, in his opinion, only after that date would there have been sufficient snowfall to react to the girl's body heat to create that ice, which, I'm no expert, so I don't know how reasonable that sounds, but to me it sounds a little just not scientific, but anyway. Harry also disagreed with the other examiners that all the wounds on the girls came from animal predation or rodents. He thought that it was proof that the girls were assaulted during their time in captivity, because again, he puts them in captivity as he believes they died like a week after. He took the wounds on their bodies to be possibly signs of blunt force trauma and strangulation. And he claimed that Patricia was also found to have semen inside of her. And that she had been sexually assaulted as well as Barbara, which is weird that I don't know how he would determine that when the other examiners did not. I don't know how that came about, and I just find that very odd, and really doesn't quite add up for me, but that's what he says, and that's what the people of the internet say he says. If anybody has any knowledge of how you determine, to me it's the presence of semen would be the only way that they would have determined whether or not Barbara had been either involved in some sort of sexual activity or sexually assaulted. And that's what he was claiming was found inside of Patricia. And it's either there was semen or there wasn't. So I don't know. Harry seemed to be a bit of a problem for the investigators, or at least the medical examiners. He began to claim that the investigators or medical examiners had hidden some of the more gruesome aspects of the murders from the family and the media, the sexual assaults in particular. He also claimed that the wounds on the girls had not been investigated properly, and basically accused the investigators of doing this to shield the family from the upsetting details. And Harry would end up getting himself into some trouble, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Now, all of this autopsy argumentation stuff I found to be very confusing, and I also found a lot of people claiming different things. So of everything in this episode, that is what I'm least confident about. I think I pretty sufficiently laid out what I found to be the most credible, but please hit me up in the comments if you believe something to be different. I would love to know and update and whatever. So with the autopsies done, the investigation continued, and the police felt that they were under a lot of pressure, and they were, to solve this case. And they were definitely feeling that heat. Everybody wanted it solved. It's child murder, so duh, right? They had interviewed a lot of people. They brought in a bunch of guys. They were pulling in drifters and drug addicts and pretty much all the undesirables they could find, sexual predators and what have you. Now, one such individual was a guy by the name of Edward Lee Bedwell, although more often referred to as Benny Bedwell, and that's what I will refer to him going forward. That's what I will refer to him as going forward. Now, Benny was 21 years old, and he was a bit of a troublemaker, admittedly. He worked as a dishwasher on and off at a place on Skid Row, which is an area that he also frequented in Chicago. And Skid Row, I think it's obvious from the name, is not a very nice place. He as well had what they called at the time, quote, diminished intellectual capacity, end quote. Although I'm sure they used a much less polite way to say that at the time. But anyway, the investigators found somebody, it was a taxi driver, I believe, who said that he saw the girls with Benny and another guy at a restaurant. And when they brought photos of the girls to the restaurant owner and asked about this incident, she confirmed that story and told them that it was Benny who was with the girls. And she knew it was Benny because this was the restaurant that he worked as a dishwasher at, so she knew him personally. And so naturally, they took him in for questioning. And after interrogating Benny for a very long time, 4 days, he would later claim, he ended up confessing to the whole thing. Although it's funny because Benny was completely illiterate and couldn't write, but he produced a multi-page, I think it was 6-page written statement confession. Now, the Chicago police were obviously pretty pleased with themselves. The case was closed. They thought, let's call it a day, boys. But their enthusiasm did not last because it soon became very obvious to everyone that Benny was not their man. None of his statements added up. He got all of the facts wrong. Pretty much everything was disputed with the autopsy. One thing in particular was that Benny claimed that he and his friend, his confession included that they hung out with the girls for a week. They were all together, and then the boys fed them hot dogs and alcohol, and then they went out to go hook up with the girls in a car, and the girls were like, nah, we don't want this, which is a weird scenario. They've been hanging out for a week apparently. And then they ended up killing them. And just the hot dogs and alcohol alone was enough for them to say, no, this is not true, as we know what their stomach contents were, and we know that they had no alcohol in their systems. Even back in 1957, way before we had all this fuss made about coerced confessions and innocent people being in prison, a fuss which I very much agree with, by the way. Even before all of that, it was very clear that nobody could allow this to stand and that this was a false or coerced confession. Loretta was not buying it. She wanted Benny thoroughly investigated, of course, but even she would later approach Benny's mother to tell her that she knew her son was not responsible.
The charges made by Bedwell must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and he should be made to testify at this inquest and repeat these charges in front of our family. Our children are dead and cannot deny these lies, but our family must live with them. We demand an absolute vindication until proven otherwise.
Now, despite this, the police were really ready to send Benny away for this. They wanted it to be him. Of course, they had some very flimsy and kind of suspicious eyewitness statements and his confession, and it was very open and shut until it wasn't. There were some girls who ended up coming forward who actually had been with Benny and his friend Frank that night. And these girls were of Indian descent, but I'm sure it was possible that people had mistaken these girls for the Grimes sisters. Another friend of Benny's came forward and actually provided an alibi for him for the night and time that his confession had him disposing of the bodies. This guy had been with Benny on a bus during this exact date and time, and so came forward and told the police that. Thankfully, reason took over and all of this got shut down before an innocent person was put away. Imagine if that had happened. Now, Bedwell also went on to claim later that the police had beaten the confession out of him, that they held him at the station, interrogating him for 4 days, and convinced him that they would let him go once he admitted everything. all the markings of a classic coerced confession. Now, after Benny was released, it seems that a pretty strict divide began to form. There was Sheriff Lohman, who was kind of the leader of this camp that I'm about to explain, where he felt that somehow this had all been political. He vehemently denied Benny's accusations that he was assaulted or bribed by investigators. He appeared to take the whole thing very personally as well. So and what I'm saying is that he believed Benny was responsible for this, and he was very upset when they ended up letting him go. Harry Gloss also threw his own little unofficial press conference at his own house, where he then publicly stated that he thought that there were people within the police force, whatever, who were covering something up. And he went on to discuss his disagreements with the medical examiners, the disagreements that I explained before. And this incident is what led to him being fired. Harry had to accuse the two other coroners of not doing their jobs properly at best, or in a worst case scenario that they had for some reason lied in their reports. So it was his accusations that ended up being his demise. But in the end, it wasn't too bad, because Sheriff Lohman, who was also in the same camp as Harry Gloss, ended up hiring him back at another position. So, whatever. But they kind of acted as though they were like the whistleblowers of this whole thing, which, I don't really know who to believe in all of this, because it seems like they were kind of, putting themselves on the line to like, for what they thought was the truth in a way, at least Harry, which in some way you have to like kind of think is like respectable. It's like, if you really, because they were the ones saying that there was some sort of cover up. But at the same time, it's like, Harry, do you know, like, you're not a medical examiner, so I don't know how you're coming to these conclusions. And it really did seem like Benny Bedwell had produced a coerced confession. So if that was the case, then Sheriff Lohman seems like a pretty shady individual. So to me, it's really hard to tell, The next suspect that they pulled about was 53-year-old Walter Kranz, and he had called the tip line on January 15th, so this was before the girls were found, and he told the tip line people that the girls were dead and that their bodies would be found in Santa Fe Park. Now, the police searched the park, and they never found the girls there, obviously. But Santa Fe Park was only about 1 mile away from the location where their bodies were eventually found. Now, Walter had called anonymously and wanted to stay anonymous, but they were eventually able to track him down. They were able to locate the phone which he called on, which was at some sort of tavern. And he at first denied making the call, but eventually he did admit to it. And Walter told the police that the only reason he made the call was because... here's another very classic aspect to this case, because he was a psychic, and he had a dream that showed him where the girls might be, and so he felt compelled to call in this tip. So Michael claimed that he was not involved at all, and he was given 3 polygraph tests after the fact, which he did mostly pass, except one question, which was asked a number of different ways, and which was, did you see the bodies after the girls were killed? And this was, again, there was 3 polygraph tests, so it was asked 3 different ways. I don't know exactly how they were asked, but every single time it was that question and that question alone within the polygraph test that showed deception. So it's definitely possible that he stumbled upon the bodies. However, no, it does make sense, because he did call probably while the girls were there and after they had died. So that is definitely pretty suspicious. And the police did not want to let him go after finding that out, but and again, polygraph tests mean absolutely nothing. But okay. So they didn't want to let him go, but they really didn't have anything on him other than the polygraph tests, and those are inadmissible. So that doesn't help if you want to keep a suspect. There were some handwriting experts who said that his writing matched some of the ransom notes received by Loretta, but to me, that also means pretty much nothing. There was a lot of ransom notes, so like there was a lot to compare to, and no offense, but handwriting experts in the 50s. I'm somewhat skeptical of your field now, so that's a stretch for me. No offense. The police seem to be kind of at a loss. As I said, there were so many tips, so many eyewitness accounts. I don't even really feel the need to go through them, as it's clear that even the main ones that people discuss, they can't all be true because there's a lot of overlap. And people who say they saw the sisters on their way home or the next day, like, it reminds me a lot of the Lacey Peterson case. Assuming you know it, it's extremely famous, but to me, that case really all comes down to the multiple people who say they saw Lacey walking her dog at the time that we know that Scott was out fishing. Now, if you believe one of these people's accounts to be true, then it seems very unlikely that he did it. But if you can see a world in which all of these people were A, lying, B, mistaken, or C, confused, then the rest of the case does make a lot of sense in terms of Scott's guilt. In this case, there were a bunch of eyewitness accounts, and it's certainly possible that one or more of them were true, but which ones? How could you tell? Now, there was one account that stuck out, and I only mean that in a sense that a lot of people have picked out this account, and it's talked about a lot. And that was from a young man named Roger Menard, I don't know, who he was at the same screening of Love Me Tender as the girls were, and he says that he left the theater about 1 minute before the Grimes sisters, and that while they were walking, a late model green Buick stopped alongside them, and he said that the girls hesitated for a second but then continued walking. He said that as he passed 42nd Street, with the girls now ahead of him somehow, a black 1949 Mercury, which was occupied by 2 teenage boys, pulled alongside them, and they giggled but continued walking in the direction that they were going in. Now this guy really knows his cars and, was able to remember them very well. But there was chatter later that it never really went anywhere, with all these guys who had stopped with their cars, and it's still unclear, but it's maybe thought that they ended up going with some of these guys, and again, nothing really came of it. But I think it's just important to mention that. Maybe it's not, but I did anyway. Now, 1 year after the murders, nothing had been solved. There'd been false accusations and a lot of investigation, but nobody went down for the crime. Loretta made a public statement stating her belief about what happened to the girls. She thought that they had been murdered by someone known to them, mainly because she did not believe that they would have been lured away by a stranger. And Loretta went on to die well before ever learning what happened to her daughters. Again, still we don't know what happened to her daughters, but she went on to pass away. To this day, the murders remain unsolved, but there are a few theories, and I will take you through those theories now. So, the first is a man by the name of Charles Leroy Melquist. In 2010, an ex-West Chicago police officer named Raymond Johnson began looking into this case, and he kind of stumbled upon it as he was doing research on a book that he was writing about, like, the dark history of Chicago. And in 2013, he was kind of like officially put on it. But it was Raymond's belief that this case was still very solvable, and he even thought that he knew who was responsible. And he believes that it is a man named Charles Leroy Melquist. Now, Charles was 23 at the time of the murders, and he was a self-confessed child killer. And I'll tell you that story now. So it was in 1958, and it was a year after the Grimes sisters were found murdered. Leroy was convicted of murdering 15-year-old Bonnie Lee Scott. Charles and Bonnie had actually dated before, which was creepy even then. The two had gotten together when Bonnie was only 14 and Charles was, I think, 20 or 21. And according to Charles, they were not together at the time of her murder, but they did remain friends. And he claims that they had this like brother-sister relationship and that like he was there for her and helped her, but then he murdered her. Bonnie had come from a pretty troubled home. Her mother was locked up in a psychiatric hospital, and she lived with her grandmother at the time. Now, Bonnie was found eventually about 2 months after she went missing, and she was badly decomposed, and she had been decapitated when they found her. Her head was found about 20 feet away from her body. She was found only 10 miles from where the Grimes sisters were found. So after Bonnie's body was found, Charles was super cooperative with the police. He was interviewed extensively for one day, and then he came back a second day to chat with them even more. And it was he who asked them to give him a polygraph test, which he failed. And not only did he fail the polygraph test, he also proceeded to confess to murdering Bonnie during the test, and he was super gruesome with the details. He said that the day that he killed her, he picked her up in his car and then drove her out to a wooded area so that they could hook up, even though they weren't dating. But things got a little bit out of control, and he ended up holding a pillow to her face and accidentally suffocating her to death. Now, I'm not exactly sure, but it does sound like he was claiming that this was part of like a sex act gone wrong type of thing, as he claimed that it was during them hooking up and an accident. So after he realized that she was dead, he took off her clothes and then dumped her where she was eventually found. I don't know why he took off her clothes, but he said that he did it. And then the next day, he woke up and he thought that he had dreamed the whole thing. He was just, in such a daze. So he drove back to the location that he remembered dumping her in his dream to see if it was a dream or not. And when he found her body, he says that he just randomly decided to cut off her head. And then he burned her clothes and called it a day. Now, Melquest went on to be convicted of this murder, but he was never questioned in connection with the Grimes sisters' murders, and that was because his lawyer at the time forbade it. Now, he was already in prison for the other murder, so there wasn't much that they could do in terms of investigating him for the Grimes murders. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about why Raymond believes that Melquest is the killer of the Grimes girls. So the day after Bonnie was found, Loretta received another freaky call from somebody who claimed to have just committed the perfect murder that the police would never solve. Now, Loretta was convinced that this caller was the same one who called in 1957 who told her about Patricia's crossed toes. She said, quote, "I will never forget that voice," end quote. And Raymond believed that this caller was Charles Leroy. Charles had been convicted of murdering Bonnie Scott, and he received a sentence of 99 years in prison, but he was released after serving only 8 years. And he went on to get married and have kids and live his best life until dying in 2010. Now, Raymond believed that Charles had been able to slither through the system due to his possible involvement in organized crime, which was rampant in Chicago at this time. Now, Charles had the same very high-profile lawyer as a lot of these organized crime guys did, which was very unusual seeing as he didn't have any money to afford this type of representation. And Raymond also theorized that Charles had exactly the type of military background which would have equipped him for taking down 2 girls. Not a super easy feat without weapons, and they weren't shot. Now, Raymond also believed that there was some sort of shady shit going on because, as I mentioned before, I briefly mentioned it, but when Betty Bedwell was accused of this crime, there was a couple eyewitness reports that had him at the restaurant that were able to identify him exactly, his exact height, exactly what he was wearing from a very far. It was a guy across the street through a window saw him and was perfectly able to identify him in a suspiciously perfect way. And so Raymond also theorized that some of these eyewitness accounts were plants by the mafia in order to throw suspicion onto Bedwell. And I guess you could even say that, people like Sheriff Lohman and Harry Gloss could have also been plants of the mafia. As we know, the mafia has been known to be able to buy police officers and experts and all that type of thing. Definitely possible. I do think it is a reasonable theory, but it's a lot of speculation and guessing, not a lot of hard evidence. Now, Raymond started a Facebook group in 2011 called Help Solve Chicago's Grime Sisters Murder, for people to talk about this case and work with each other. The group now has over 2,000 members. I've requested but have not been approved yet. And yes, Facebook. This is where people used to get together and solve crimes. Remember Luca Magnotta? Now it's more so done on like Reddit and Twitter and stuff like that, as the new generation has taken over. But back in the day, that's where it was, and that's where this group was. Now there's another theory that requires that I take you back to the year 1955. And this was focused on heavily by a pretty recent documentary that was made by WGN News, which I wasn't able to get in its entirety, but I was able to see a lot of clips on YouTube. And they talk a lot about this theory. So, October 18th, 1955, a salesman was on his lunch break and he stopped for a moment to glance at what he at first thought were some discarded store mannequins. Where have we heard that before? Now, upon further investigation, this poor man realized what he was actually seeing and called in the police. The horrific scene that this poor man just stumbled upon was a triple homicide, and the victims were John Schuesser, age 13, his brother Anton Schuesser, age 17, and their friend Robert Peterson, age 14. The trio had been missing for 2 days. On the Sunday before they went missing, their last known whereabouts were a trip downtown via the bus to see a showing of the new movie African Lion by Walt Disney, followed by some bowling. But the boys never arrived home. Damn, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Now, a journalist listening to a police scanner caught wind of this whole scenario as it was unfolding, and the reporters ended up getting to the scene actually before the police did. And after that, it was just yet another shit show where bodies were touched, they were left out uncovered in the sun for hours, decomposing away. It was a pathetic excuse for a crime scene investigation. Now, despite the craziness at the crime scene, autopsies were successful and their deaths were ruled as strangulations. But it also appeared that they had all been beaten before their deaths. And they were also found completely nude as well. I don't know if I mentioned that. Now, their deaths rocked the community, of course, and there was a lengthy investigation. But alas, nobody was ever arrested for these heinous crimes. And that was until about 40 years later. The police were investigating another murder, as well as some suspected cases of arson of several stables and the deaths of some very expensive horses. During this investigation, a conversation with an informant led him to mentioning that Kenneth Hansen was the person responsible for the murder of those 3 boys. Kenneth Hansen was a horse guy, I guess an owner of horses. He owned a barn and a bunch of horses, and he was very well known in the horse showing community at the time. And he was living in the Willow Springs area, very close to where the girls were found. Several younger guys who worked for Kenneth as stable boys and such, they claimed that Kenneth had often made comments while reprimanding them that if they didn't do what he wanted or if they didn't whatever, that they would end up in a ditch like the Schuessler boys. They claimed that he went on to admit to them that he was responsible for murdering them. I don't know if Kenneth would say that these guys were lying or if he would say that he was only saying that as some sort of like weird sick joke, but either way, he maintained his innocence. He claimed he had nothing to do with these murders. Regardless of that, he was tried for the murders of the boys and convicted, and he received a sentence of no less than 200 years, no more than 300. I guess they were very concerned about him living past 200. And he was old at the time because this was 40 years after the murder. During his trial, Kenneth was accused of organizing hit squads to hunt and kill a wealthy horseman named George Jane on behalf of, I guess, Jane's brother. There was also another claim that Hansen had hired 2 men to burn down a competitor's stable, and another man got up there and accused Hansen of raping him. Hansen himself later admitted in the years after the triple murder that he had molested over 1,000 boys. So this guy sounds like a completely unhinged individual and a predator. Now, there has always been people who found the murders of these 3 boys and the murders of the Grimes sisters to have a lot of similarities. For one, there was more than one of them. There were siblings involved. Both sets of victims were found naked and seemingly tossed on the side of the road. They were all young, kind of in the same age ranges. The boys had also taken a bus to go see a movie, just like the Grimes sisters had. And it was later discovered that the land on which the Grimes sisters were found on, that land had at one time been leased to Kenneth as a pasture for his horses. There was also an employee of Kenneth's who was known to have been in the theater the night that the Grimes sisters were there watching Love Me Tender. And that sounds kind of random, but it's, I guess, led some people to speculate, especially given the allegations that he had, hired hits on people or otherwise conspired with other people to cause harm to other people. In 2005, the semen sample that was collected from Barbara's body up and went missing. They had pulled it out to analyze it, and it got lost, which is too bad because it could have been compared to Kenneth. His sample was in the database, and Kenneth went on to later die in 2007. That semen sample could have been the key to solving this case, especially now given what we know we can do with familial DNA. So it really makes you wonder, was it general incompetence that caused it to be lost, or does somebody in the system not want us to solve this case? I don't know. Now, those are the two kind of biggest theories, and both of them, I think, seem somewhat possible, but I think they still both leave a lot of, holes, Kenneth Hansen does seem like a super predator, and there are a lot of similarities between the cases, but I've seen no evidence or no claims that he had ever assaulted women. Seems like he was super into boys and men specifically. And with the Charles Leroy Melquist thing, it just seems like there's a lot of reaching. Not necessarily reaching, but a lot of guesses. So I don't know. To me, this case is definitely solvable, but only if you had that semen sample. And where the hell is it? It went missing in 2005, and that's a really long time ago, so I don't see how we would ever be able to find it, which really sucks because it seems like, especially now, it would be so easy to find somebody related to that sample, which really, really sucks. Now, there's only one living relative left of the Grimes sisters, like a main relative, and that's their sister Teresa, and she was featured in the WGN News documentary, which can be found, bits of it, I guess, can be found on YouTube. And that's really where the case lies. If you know any other theories, I know there is something about the like Mercury car and like some guys who were in the car, that to me seemed a little less solid than the other two. I don't even know who I would bet on between, I think probably Charles Leroy Melquist, because at least he seemed to murder girls for fun. It's just all horrific. But if you didn't make it this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear theories. I'd love to hear if there was anything that you think that I got wrong. If you enjoyed this, I would really appreciate you subscribing or signing up to my newsletter at grimweekly.com. And you can find me on Instagram at Who's Knocking Podcast, Twitter at Who's Knocking Pod, email me hello@who'sknockingpodcast.com. And please stay safe out there because you never know who's knocking. This podcast is produced in collaboration with Lost Line Media. Artwork by August Digital. Music by Matthew Cook.